This is from a book called, is it a book? Yeah, this is from a book called Rules versus Relationships. Rules versus Relationships, by John M. Conley and William M. O'Barr, University of Chicago Press, 1990. So, among other things, they say there are two orientations to law. Well, there's the two-valued orientation right away, but we got to stay with. It's useful at least. The two-valued orientation is useful as long as we know what we're doing. The minute we say that, we go, oh, it's two-valued orientation. Surely it's more complicated than that. But it's a good first step in modeling, perhaps, in many contexts. So he says there are two orientations to law: relational and rule-oriented. Now, I would suggest that what he's calling relational is more non-Aristotelian, and what he's calling rule-oriented is more Aristotelian. Rule-oriented litigants, he's talking about participants in the legal process, lawyers and judges, and legal theorists. Rule-oriented litigants interpret disputes in terms of rules and principles for assessing responsibility. They reject as irrelevant everything not circumscribed within these rules. So we could say, here we have the rules, and here we have what is going on at the object level, and here we have the semantic block, which rejects everything that is not covered by or relevant to the rules at the label level. I'm translating into Korzybskian. This crew, the rule-oriented litigants, seems to be rooted in the belief that society is a network not of relationships but of contractual opportunities that each individual has the power to accept or reject. So he's making a link here between the Aristotelian orientation in law and contractarian individualistic theories of society. They structure their accounts as a deductive search for blame. I was talking about blame before. So the law is about finding someone to blame. Every injury is presumed to have a human agent as its cause. There is a search for a one and only person on whom responsibility can be plausibly fixed. So one might say for a scapegoat, if one wanted to exaggerate a little bit, perhaps. And he contrasts that with a relationship-oriented, a relational orientation to law. The relational orientation, even an event such an automobile accident involving strangers, may be described in terms of the social history of the parties. So we've got the date there right away, historicity. Litigants giving relational accounts are more likely to assert that certain things just happen to certain kinds of people. So instead of the search for blame, there's the kind of acceptance that things just happen. Or as Henry Ford said, just one damn thing after another. You know what that is? When Henry Ford was asked to give his view of history, he said history is just one damn thing after another. Of course, that didn't prevent him from being one of the main circulators of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the United States for 20 years, for which he eventually apologized, I guess after a lot of pressure from the Zionist lobby. I think maybe that's all I wanted to give you there. Or maybe not, a little bit more. Judges often excoriate givers of relational accounts for wasting the court's time, and their own lawyers sometimes label them illogical, stupid, or even crazy. Rule-oriented decision-making has the appearance of strict neutrality. Thus, those whose relational orientations denies them access to power derive false comfort from the illusion of a system that treats all people equally. And by way of some kind of conclusion, thus, even under the best of circumstances, the permanent record of the case yields only a distant echo of the living discourse of the dispute as it evolved. Most voices are silenced. Those that do survive do so in a barely recognizable form. You see how that fit into what I was talking about before. Stick it back here where it belongs. When Debs was in jail, he probably didn't ask people, well, what are you in for? And, well, don't you think your sentence was a little bit excessive? Or that kind of thing. He would find out about who they were, their lives, how they happened to end up happening to do the things that happened to land them in jail, etc., etc. Okay, back to monsters. I was talking about the devil as the personification of evil. I was talking about how evil is, at least to a very large extent, the personification of evil. That's what evil is. It's the personification of evil. Hitler, for example, was a monster. To us, Hitler was a monster. To many Germans, of course, he was a loving protector of his people. Well, wasn't he? Some believed that his picture on the wall would repel the monstrous bombs of the monstrous Allies. So there's plenty of monstrosity to go around. I was just reading the other day, I think it was the 100th anniversary of the city of Dresden. Hatred, when intense, well, there's a little gap here in my discourse. I'm talking about notions, images associated with the monstrosity of the enemy, the monstrosity of the evil enemy. When hatred is intense, it is frequently associated in the imagination with poisons and diseases, especially cancer. When you see some kind of political opposition described as cancer, you know what you're dealing with. Hitler's Mein Kampf, has anyone read it? I read it when I was 13. I read it in its English translation, but it was a Nazi book with a gold swastika on the cover. I was reading it in Israel, in Tel Aviv, in 1951, 6-7 years after the end of World War II. I was carrying it around on the bus in Tel Aviv, and people were looking at me and smiling. I guess it's because I was 13, and I looked 13. There's this big gold swastika on the cover, and I noticed people smiling at me and looked around and saw that about a third of them had numbers on their arms. So I don't think I did that again. But it was no big deal, and I read it from cover to cover. Actually, most of Hitler's thoughts were about syphilis, not about cancer, so that makes him a little bit deviant as a monstrifier. Because one of his notions of the Jew was that the Jew is pulling the strings of the Negro, and the Negro is spreading syphilis among the Aryan population in order to poison the blood of the German people. So images of disease and poisoning, especially blood poisoning, often associated with sexuality. Just the little image I showed you last week there's very often a sort of sexual imagery of the protection of women and children from the sexual depredations of the evil, monstrous enemy. And lots of images and ideas about baby killing, which you'll see shortly as I give you some images to poison your minds with. There's also a lot of monstrifying mind reading in the sense of the enemy wants to destroy us, or they hate us for our freedoms, or they want to destroy our way of life. But it's not only by violence that they want to destroy our way of life, but by contamination. So again, there's that disease imagery is very important. And the idea of health or hygiene as involving the repulsion of poisonous, disease-ridden alien elements. Well, maybe we could pause to look at some images. This is one of the nicest books I've seen. It's by a neo-Jungian named Sam Keen. The subtitle is The Psychology of Enmity. Faces of the Enemy, Reflections of the Hostile Imagination. I've stuck some paper in there so that you don't have to, please don't look at all the pages. Just sort of flip through and look at the pages that I've marked out for you. I laugh. Okay, I think I marked out 3-4 pages. I'll tell you about something I just found on the web the other night, and that is I found William Burroughs' registration form for the General Semantics workshop in 1933. He was 25 years old. They had to give pictures of themselves for some reason, so there's this photo of the 25-year-old William Burroughs.
Homeland Security.
And there's a list of the other participants in the workshop. Margaret Mead, William V. Quine, the more I experience the enemy as evil, as malevolence personified, the more I treat him as such, and the more he experiences me as such and responds in kind, the more he fulfills my expectation or confirms my prophecy. So we have there a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we have the structure of a vicious circle here. The more I demonize him, the more he acts like a demon and justifies my demonization of him, and vice versa. So we have a kind of reciprocal demonization. And today it's reached the meta heights, because today we demonize the other as the demonizer. So it's like, you are the demonizer. No, you are the demonizer. You are demonizing me. No, you are demonizing me. Etc., etc. Self-fulfilling prophecy, or self-fulfilling expectation. Ginsberg, one of Allen Ginsberg's little poems was called Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. That was about the Vietnam War. Self-fulfilling prophecy is actually a notion invented by a prominent American sociologist, now largely forgotten, named Merton. Some of you may even have come across his name in your studies as social scientists. The converse of a self-fulfilling prophecy is a self-deleting error. It was mistaken when you started it, but you made it real, so it's a self-deleting error. I mean, how often do you have to say to someone, you hate me, you hate me, you hate me, you hate me, without actually arousing his or her hatred? C. Wright Mills, really curious. There are people who are gone and really curious about what sorts of positions they would take on various matters today. But how many of you have heard of C. Wright Mills? Okay, well, that's a relief. So C. Wright Mills, I could tell you stories about him, but I just want to mention right now, one of his last books was called The Causes of World War III, in which he condemns American hysteria about Soviet communist expansionism. And he talks there about, he calls it the military metaphysic, which he explains is a kind of, it involves an expectation of violence. So in that sense, we're talking again about this kind of structure of self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you expect violence and prepare for violence, the more likely violence becomes. Of course, once you're caught in this circle, it's not so easy to get out. I mean, you can watch thousands of marchers in the streets screaming, "No war, no war, no war," but here you are in the middle of preparations for war. What are you going to do? Disarm unilaterally? I don't think so. No one should say they would until they find themselves in a position of power. the situation is a lot more complicated than, I'm not offering any solutions here, for example. The fear-hate of both sides often intensifies in the manner of a vicious circle. The more. It's called positive feedback in systems theory. The system will go into runaway. So the more of this, the more of this, the more of this, the more of this, and it goes into, that's called positive feedback because it positively reinforces itself. Negative feedback is something that stops the cycle or slows it down. Positive feedback is something that keeps it going. And when the system goes into runaway in systems theoretical language, there's some kind of explosion, some kind of explosion like war. And war too, there's all degrees of war. So you can go from war to total war. Dresden was total war. Maybe the mark of total war is the criminalization of the enemy. So not only do you call him a monster in your propaganda, but you actually begin to believe that the enemy is monstrous and should be treated not as a noble enemy, but as an evil monster who should only be destroyed rather than made peace with. I was reading the other day about how Winston Churchill was determined to borrow an electric chair from the Americans and electrocute Hitler in public if he could get his hands on him. Maybe you could think of someone you would like to electrocute, thus solving the world's problems. So a systems theory, and of course systems theories tend to be non-Aristotelian. So we could say that the Aristotelian orientation sees evil, fear, hate, malevolence, rage as characteristic of relations rather than of elementalistically marked out persons or groups of persons. It's about relations rather than persons or groups. It's about isms almost rather than ists. We personify evil, and that is the source of evil. Fear, hate, hyphenate, never separate, arise out of the interactions of many causes and conditions and are not simply located. We don't simply locate hate, rage, malevolence, aggression. We don't simply locate it anywhere. We don't even simply locate it in both sides. You could say, here are the enemies. We could say, oh, we wouldn't simply locate it only in X. We would also locate it in Y. But that's just elementalism plus elementalism. It's not getting away from elementalism. Like, for example, I can remember way back in 1951 in high school in Calgary, hearing Christians on radio in Calgary saying, well, why don't the Jews and the Arabs simply behave like good Christians and get together and settle their problems rationally? Why, indeed, half a century ago, that would have been the time for it. And, of course, we could also say, very piously, as many Christians would, we are all at fault. So we're collectivizing personal guilt there, but it's still personal guilt. We're still locating it in persons, as in we are all at fault, which is often just hypocrisy. But when it's not hypocrisy, it's still elementalistic. And of course, the more intense the hate, the more it needs to be justified. So the louder the screams for justice, the more intense the hate, and the greater the need to justify it in terms of justice. That's a broad generalization. That's all right. Well, it's going to be pretty difficult to shift the focus from persons to systems. You know, it may be that one of the flaws of Marxism as a movement, and maybe going back to Marx himself as a person, is that although Marx had a perfectly, highly developed understanding of systems, and his theory is far from elementalistic, in fact, it is a non-elementalistic systems theory, still when it got around to movement building and rhetoric and propaganda, he could demonize the enemy up there just with anybody else. And the movements that succeeded Marx perfected this, especially in Russia, where the belief in witchcraft never really died out completely. So that in Stalinist Russia, the location of enemies of the people, in particular persons to be purged, is kind of parallel to the location of witches as the cause of disaster in medieval Europe. And in both Stalinist Russia and medieval Europe, I was just reading about this recently, the comparison of Stalinist purges and show trials with medieval witch purges and show trials, it sort of explains the extreme importance that both cultures placed on confession. Of course, it made more sense for a witch to confess because if she did, she could be forgiven and maybe go to heaven. Stalinist doesn't believe in heaven, so you could say that the Stalinist witch hunt is even less rational than the medieval witch hunt. By the way, if you want reference to this, it's in a journal called the Journal of Totalitarianism and Political Religions, the most recent issue. The discussion, the comparison of purge, the Stalinist purge and the witch trial. It turns out that Stalin as a child was actually cured by a witch of an image that was disturbing to his mother. His mother called in a witch for the cure. And of course, Stalin had episodes of anti-Semitism, and he was a lot less single-minded than Hitler about this, but occasionally when he was really freaking out, he would zero in on the Jewish doctor's plot, the Zionist lobby, and other such sources of malevolence. Try to save Soviet communism from sabotage by finding the right enemies of the people and purging them. It's not a systems theoretical approach. But among certain practical consequences, it did keep him in power, or helped to keep him in power. Okay, let's move to more comfortable territory, that is non-political territory, where it'll be easier for us to deal with some of these notions, perhaps, at least in a setting like this. I'm going to give 2 case studies of demonization in Toronto. And I'm going to go into a fair amount of detail on it, because if Asher were here, he would disapprove, because he would say, enough storytelling and examples, just lay down the philosophical law. So one of them is, I've already showed you these boys. I'll give you a little bit more detail on these boys. They look even nicer than Hitler did at the appropriate age. These guys will never get anywhere politically. The times are not right for that. So my headline here is Evil Freaks of Nature, because that's what the judge called them when he was sentencing them to long terms in prison as 10-year-olds in England. This is in England. But it plays well in the sun, in the Toronto sun. 2 10-year-old boys in Liverpool, 1993, convicted of the murder of a 2-year-old. Okay, well, that's not nice. They were sentenced to life in jail. That means they were just recently released, I think, in 2006. And their names are Robert Thompson and John Venables. Give them a name, it's almost like you get to know them a little bit. Imagine they're your boys, for example, if you want to get to know them, just for a second. Oh, where did I go wrong? So there's a little story about this in Now magazine by Susan Cole, a name that you'll recognize. Sometimes I like her work, and sometimes I think it's right off the wall. This one's a combination. So she's writing about this case in Now, December 2nd to 8th, 1993. She denounces the excessiveness of the sentence and the ignorant comments uttered by the police, actually, evil freaks of nature. I thought it was the judge. Why, asked Cole, had there been no tracking of the lives of these kids? Relational orientation. Why had there been no tracking? But of course you'd have to start tracking before it ended up as a criminal case, which raises certain questions. Why had there been no tracking the lives of these kids to find out what the hell happened to them? And why was there no teacher to respond to the one boy who used to sit rocking and moaning in his class, sometimes bearing cuts on his flesh that he'd made himself? Well, there's the cutting again. Can't anybody see pain here? Why is it so easy to blame a child and not those people who destroyed these young spirits? See how it ends? Ultimately, though, she concludes, the cops and the judges and the teachers, they're the ones responsible for whatever messed up these two children. I'm adding a little emphasis. These youngsters are missing the human care, that only a loving caretaker can nurture and only an abuser can steal away. So we're shifting the blame from the boys to the abusers. Evil freaks of nature do not exist. Oh, okay. Well, then she's just flatly contradicting herself here in some way, sort of semi-consciously. Evil freaks of nature do not exist. Trauma does. Evil freaks of nature do not exist. So I wrote in the margin here, gee, not even Pol Pot? Pol Pot, the killing fields. Is there anything else we know about it? Not much. That's all I've ever heard. Pol Pot, killing fields. You have to be a specialist on Cambodia to find out more. I exaggerate. I know a little bit more, but not much more. Do you?
I know the numbers of the dead.
Yes. And you've seen pictures of the skulls. Cole has empathized with the children and entered into their experiences in her imagination. That's what we call empathy. She's felt their pain, and as we read her words, we empathize with her empathizing with them. And there's more coming in the course about empathy and practices of empathy, and a task that I will assign, a complicated optional task involving empathy. But notice, she can't shake the compulsion to shift the blame to adults, especially parents, to blame the ones responsible as if this buck could stop in any simple location. Okay? It's got to stop in some simple location. As if the abuser were an inherently existing freestanding self, a first cause or an originator of evil. So, if I wanted to be harsh with Cole, I would say she's just perpetuating the personification of evil in this touchy-feely pro-child manner. And you've already seen how pro-child the demonization of evil can be. Because in the end, it's about survival, as I said before. Survival means our children. Is there a sharply demarcated boundary where our empathy ought to stop? Just a question. Is there even a fuzzy boundary where our empathy ought to start stopping? Just a question. As if no causes, conditions, relations giving rise to that evil could be found other than the original sin of the abuser, him or herself, the abuser. The parents were children too, Susan. Not devil's spawn. Have you heard that term? Devil's spawn? There it is. If you stop empathy anywhere at any point, at that point you are simply personifying evil. That's what I would suggest. Well, does this mean that no one should be held accountable? Am I trying to say that no one should be held accountable? Am I trying to shift the blame to the system? No, in fact, I'm not talking about blame at all, actually. And I'm not saying that no one should be held accountable. We've already discussed a little bit the form that this holding accountable might take other than presently existing forms. What kind of holding responsible could happen from a non-Aristotelian perspective? That's the question. That's case study 1. The other one's right here in Toronto, and actually involved indirectly some of the students in the spirit course when I first talked about it.
One or two more.
This one is 1 year later, November 1994, and the headline here is Racist Attack on Toronto High School Teacher. I mean, if it was an attack on a Toronto high school teacher, that would be bad enough, but this is a racist attack on a Toronto high school teacher. And racist maybe is one of those terms that's almost achieved the status, the emotional, rhetorical status of monster. To call someone racist is almost like calling them a monster. So it becomes a fighting word. You can't actually talk about anything anymore. You can just attack, defend, defend. November 17th, 1994, Mahendra Gupta, teacher at the Humberside Collegiate. There were 3 or 4 kids in the spirit class who had been there, not when the attack took place, but a few years earlier, so they could tell me about the school. Anyone here from Humberside?
No, but I knew a lot of those kids.
Okay, Humberside Collegiate. He was a teacher there, Indian, I guess, Mahendra Gupta, attacked and seriously injured by 2 white men in the school stairwell. Well, first of all, I say 2 white men. I would like to know how old they were, these men. Had they just passed their 18th birthday, or were they 42? But that's deletion, significant deletion as far as I'm concerned. We're getting the image there of racists coming into the school from outside to attack a high school teacher. This followed several instances of racist letters to teachers from a group at this school. They were signed by a group at this school determined to push out non-white teachers. Okay, that sounds racist enough. So the implication there is that there's some connection between these letters, a group responsible for them either in or out or both of the school. And there's 2 responses on the same day in the Toronto Star. The editorial, November 26th. I used to have a copy of that, what happened to it. So this was on the front page of the Toronto Star, at the top on the left-hand side of the paper. They made a big deal out of it, really. I'm not saying it was not a big deal, but the Globe didn't do that with it. They did something else. And it's hard to read, isn't it? This was the headline. Keep the racists. Now there's an identifiable group, right? The racists. First we got to go out and find them, right? The racists. And then we got to keep the racists out of our schools. I'm not going to get into trouble for putting that on the board. Am I? If I put any other group name in there, I'm in serious trouble.
I just hate bigots.
Okay, you got the general idea there. So it's a kind of front page editorial, and it goes on like, they are after our young. Get the image of a monster looking for children? Canada is susceptible to this racist cancer. Get the disease imagery? Does anything change from Mein Kampf to the Toronto Star, other than the object of the opprobrium? We can fight back with tough police action. Tough action. And the message in every class that racism will not be tolerated. We must do all we can, universal quantifier, all we can, to keep these ugly, dangerous bigots away from the young and the innocent. Okay? Presupposition, these dangerous bigots are not ours. We have nothing to do with them. They're not ours. They are after our young. My God.
That's why we're so deeply confused when they have spawn of their own. Do you remember the case recently in Pennsylvania when there was a skinhead couple and their 3-year-old's name was Adolf Hitler Campbell?
Oh, yeah, I remember.
They couldn't get a birthday cake for him.
Yeah, I remember.
I wish I say make your own cake. What's the problem here? Doesn't take that much effort.
And, that can come up again because the kid's mother explained that she wasn't really hating anyone. She just wanted to valorize, we could say, the culture of white people. She wanted the kid to be proud of his own white culture. Certain problems come up around this one that we're not going to solve for sure, but we'll come back to it later. Now, in the very same issue of the Star, page 21, well into the middle of it, a Buddhist scholar at Trinity College named Suwas.
Is that Trinity U of T?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh God, I
Just
can't read
for
my
our
own writing.
listeners around
Something
the world.
like Suwanda. I've seen his work here and there, other than this op-ed piece he wrote for the Star about this issue. Suguna Siri. If you go into Robarts, where they have the book display, they've got the book that is displayed there, a book on Theravada Buddhist meditation. So in the same issue of the Star, he's written this op-ed piece in the religion section. Keep religion away from any real relevant. The headline there is, "There's a little piece of hatred in every one of us." Okay, well, he begins with the story of the jewel net of Indra. Everything in this universe, as physics reminds us, is interrelated. So are all human beings. Hate groups are part of a gigantic human network. Each hater is in each of us. Conversely, in each hater is a part of us. Is hating the hater the best response to hate groups? For one thing, these are our own children. So he's not excluding the haters from the group of our children. These are our own children. And why are young minds attracted to such groups? Looking for a historical, relational, rather than a rule-oriented approach here, to go back to how I began. Well, he suggests some reasons, and they won't surprise you. You've heard these. They provide a sense of family and purpose, a collective sense of identity. It is we who made them feel alienated. We worship the nuclear family, and we decimate it. Capitalism makes an idol of individualism. Cut off from relationships, the young became alienated. Well, he's got the beginnings of a kind of systems theoretical approach to this issue, which would, in court, it would just be, please don't waste the court's time, right? It would make sense to work on the enemy within, says Sugana Siri, what Jung called the shadow. It would make sense to work on the enemy within, our anger, hatred, malevolence, before we try to deal with the enemy without. Well, what kind of pap is that? By cultivating compassion. What kind of pap is that? By seeking to work with hate groups. Well, how could you possibly do that? To reach out to individuals and leaders among them. In reaching out, it is important that we listen with honest interest to their genuine concerns. And see how ridiculous it ends up. Ridiculous. We might even ask to join in celebrating their European Heritage Week. Okay? Imagine a special issue of now European History Month. It's like, hey, we don't know anything about Black history, right? But I have a question. Do we know anything about European history either? Do we know anything about Canadian history? Does anybody know who Sidney Smith was?
Yes. He built this building and named it for himself.
Named it after himself?
Yes.
As I read these quotations from Sugana Siri's piece, I myself was feeling a little incredulous. I'm trying my best to preach this stuff myself, and I'm feeling incredulous. So the incredulous semantic reactions that this will have evoked in the vast majority of readers is a sign of the incredible distance that separates our pluralist, anti-racist animal righteousness from what we might call a genuine nonviolent orientation. A genuinely nonviolent orientation, which I'll try to get out of Gandhi later. Don't know where else. So Sugana Siri suggests that we first acknowledge and work on our hatred. That would be, in this instance, our hatred of the hater. And the task that I'm going to offer, I'm sort of introducing a few steps of the task before we actually get to it, which we'll get to next week. Here is a simple diagram which will be helpful in taking this label level injunction down closer to the object level. Right? So when someone tells us we should first acknowledge and work on our own hatred, we go, yeah, that's right. We should. And go on about our business. In other words, it remains a slogan. And,
There's blame on both sides.
Yes, that's right. So here's a simple diagram which will be helpful in taking this label level injunction down closer to the object level. So this is from the NLP discourse. I guess I should directly credit Robert Dilts for womping this one up. We start out with marking out 3 positions. There's a first position, a second position, and using a different color at a higher level of abstraction but lower on the chart. We have a third position. First position is self. Second position is other. Now, right away we have, obviously, we're working with a model or a map, which is very, very simplifying, but that's an essential part of theoretical work, simplification. Again, as long as we know what we're doing. I mean, there's no indexing here. There's no self 1, self 2, self 3, etc. There's no other 1, other 2, other 3, etc. We're just starting with these positions. So we're not actually referring to people, by the way. That's useful to keep in mind also. We're referring to positions. Working here with what Dilts calls multiple perceptual positions. That is, positions from which the situation can be experienced. So there's a self position, which is first position, and a second position, which is other position. Those vicious circles I've been talking about, they're happening between these 2 positions. You know, some people get conversion experiences. They go, oh my God, I was wrong. And they go over to the other side, and the game proceeds from the other side. The third position is an observer's position. Okay?
Witness.
Witness, yes. Right. Now we could say that these are positions. All 3 positions can be occupied by the self. And the task involved by myself. So let's say, I'll put it in the first person. So I can occupy any of these 3 positions. I can move among these 3 positions, and that's what the task will involve. I can move among these 3 positions, but if I am so caught up in my enmity to the other, I forget that I can. It just becomes a matter of defending myself, my family, my people, my culture, my history. It takes a little shock to remind myself that I can actually occupy all 3 positions, that I don't have to be shoved out of sanity by the nonsensical aspects of the other's rhetoric. So, but I got ahead of myself there. I actually started talking about the task, so drag myself back. The projection of evil from we into them, so that they become the containers of evil, and we become loving, righteous victims or defenders of the self, needs to be countered by the withdrawal of the projection. So okay, how many colors do I have? Red, okay, let's take red for malevolence. Isn't red Satan's color? I guess. Okay, so I've projected my hate into the other, and I am now simply defending myself against the other. Okay? I'm justifying my hate. How? By disavowing it, by locating it in the other. And what you could call hate in me, what he would call hate in me, I would say is simply a matter of self-defense. So I've projected. That's the projection aspect that I talked about before. I projected into the other. The Jungians call this working with the shadow, bringing the shadow into the light of consciousness, which involves withdrawing the projection to the other. So I withdraw it, I take back my projection, and I locate it in myself. I'm not saying I'm the one who's to blame, but I'm willing to experience the hatred in myself. I feel it in my own body. I can focus my attention on the hatred, etc., that I feel in my own body. I learn to tolerate, to accept in myself the feelings that I had attributed solely to the other. So it becomes a matter of mindfulness then, in that sense. Owning the feeling, as some might put it, rather than disowning it. This is quite different from the conventional strategy of denouncing hatred in abstracto, not tolerating hatred, and therefore denying hatred in self. If hatred is bad, if hatred is simply bad and ought to be denounced and destroyed, then how could I possibly experience it in myself? And if I can't experience it in myself, how can I deal with it? And of course, I could constantly repeat label-level slogans such as "hate is not a family value." I could put it on a bumper sticker and sport it on my car, and other such slogans. I could carry the slogan around in the streets. Hate is bad. We should be nice, good, tolerant, respectful of good people, and tough on bad people. I always remember at some point while talking about this, there was an outfit, I don't know if they're still around in Toronto, called Anti-Racist Action. Are they still around? The favorite slogan from Anti-Racist Action, which I saw in various graffiti in Toronto, was "Die, Nazi scum."
I like it.
I do too. So I'll come back to this when we talk about Gandhi's Satyagraha. Anyway, this first step of withdrawing the projection and accepting to experience it in one's own body, we shall see how this can be a first step towards transforming the energy of vengeful, retributive, punitive, self-righteous, what Korzybski called animal righteousness. Korzybski. We can see how can be a first step towards transforming the energy of animal righteousness into the energy of nonviolent struggle. Hey, nonviolent struggle against nonviolent systems. Not nonviolent struggle against violent others. Not how you've fallen almost all the way back into the old thing there. Nonviolent struggle against violent systems or patterns of relations, always involving many sides. It's not even both sides, always involving many sides. More than two, more than three. Well, what kind of struggle would this be? It would be fundamentally a struggle against the personification of evil. You'll see how Gandhi managed to contribute significantly to the independence of India while simultaneously emphasizing the fundamental importance of struggling against the personification of evil. Of course, that would only work against the British because the British were so nice. You've heard that story. So this diagram also shows, in a simplifying manner, the relational nature of hatred, because malevolence is not simply located in one, or in two, nor in both. It's located in their relationships, in their relating, let's say. Make it less of a nominalization. It's located in their relating. We see how systems, just with that, we can see how systems operate often in a viciously circular manner, and we can see how insane it is to seek solutions in finding someone's to blame and in dragging them before the court of whatever. The same diagram can also be used to visualize the process of empathy. If you read Science and Sanity carefully, you'll come across at least a few pages where Korzybski emphasizes the importance of visualization. Well, we could have predicted that given the importance that he ascribes to the structural differential, which is even more visualization than most visualizations. So I can actually, in my imagination, move into the other. I really don't feel like doing this today because I'm still hot. I'm still seething. But at least for a moment, I can, in my imagination, move into the other. I can get behind his eyes. I could actually get behind the eyes of the other. Yes, I can hear what he is saying to himself in my own head. I can do this in my imagination. The task will involve doing this. I can feel her feelings to some extent in my face, chest, and belly. I can get a sense of the past experiences she had, the past learnings he had, which shaped the stories that they have been living. I can find out and feel something of the why behind her actions. So I'm not interested in understanding her label level position or in determining how much I agree or disagree with it. More on that later too. By the way, anyone who knows a bit about psychotherapy knows how important empathy is in the position of psychotherapist. And it's a good vantage point from which to understand that we can also put a damper on it to the extent necessary. Because if you fully empathize, with every broken soul that came to you for help, you'd end up pretty broken yourself. So there are ways of limiting this. I worked with one named Connie Ray Andreas, Steve Andreas, his wife, who explained that when she worked with people, she sort of felt some of their feelings on the outside of her body. So she could sort of modulate exactly how much of the other's feelings to feel, and in that way get to decide, what amount of actual experienced empathy is appropriate in a certain situation. In the same context, I might mention that if you play this game without having a good, strong first position, you're finished. A good, strong first position. You have to know who you are, who your family is, who your people are, what they are interested in defending. It's only from the standpoint of that first position that you can go out and enter into the other to some extent, or to the extent necessary. I heard the story, I'm not sure if it's true or not, and I keep asking people if they can verify it for me. I know that in the first years of the Nazi regime, there was a German Jewish outfit called the Vaterland Front, which believed that it was not an unreasonable belief at the time that Hitler might be persuaded to leave his anti-Semitism behind if the Jews showed appropriate behavior and did not arouse anti-Semitism through excessively Jewish behavior. German Jews were always good at they had 100 years of history in learning to tamp down their excessively Jewish behavior. Well, obviously it didn't work. But it worked for some Jews who were actually able to get Aryanization certificates. It's one of the interesting stories of the Holocaust about how some people actually managed to get them declared Aryans. One of the weirdest stories I heard was from an Iranian friend who told me, and I verified it in text, that the Iranian ambassador in Berlin, actually managed to persuade the top Nazis that Persian Jews were not ethnically Jewish. Mm-hmm. And so they got off the hook. So that's biological racism. So when we want to throw the word racism around, we should know to what extremes it can be taken before we just throw it around loosely at anyone who offends us through some kind of disrespect to our group. I'm sure disrespect is a horrible thing. But I heard that there was actually a group of pro-Nazi Jews in Germany who participated in Nazi demonstrations carrying signs saying things like "Raus mit uns." Get it? Raus mit uns. Nazi slogan was "Juden raus," Jews out, Jews out, Jews out. It was one of their favorite slogans. Can you see the goose step? Well, actually, it was only the troops that goose stepped, but your common people could go "Juden raus." So imagine a Jew joining a demonstration that is yelling "Juden raus." That's a pretty weak to non-existent first position. You're not gonna get anywhere from there. Okay. I don't know if this is fiction or not. I mean, it could be a kind of cartoonish attack on the following by those who disagreed with them. So more on that when we go to the task. And Nazi skull sort of hurts to erase that, because it satisfies that animal righteous part of self. One of the high points of my experiences with this kind of thing was Anti-Racist Action once got together with other left-wing groups, and we organized a counter-demonstration at Mussolini's birthday celebrations. The local Western Guard fascist outfit had headquarters in the East End somewhere, and they were celebrating Mussolini's birthday, and we went down there to demonstrate against celebration of Mussolini's birthday. What that was going to accomplish, I don't know, but sure made us. A good time was had by all. The fascists were standing out there on their porches with broken beer bottles, ready for the attack, which never, thank God, materialized. Those guys don't give a shit.
Do they have birthday cake? Do they have?
Maybe Sagana Siri would have advised us to
Take some cake.
all right. Yeah, well, the police didn't even have to break it up. It just dissipated. Okay, I can move into a third or observer position, a third position, from which I can see third eye, from which I can see how the relating of self with other gives rise to our opposing positions at the first and second poles. In some versions of the task, I can even make some kind of effort to go back in history, do some time travel to the origins of the conflict, which are usually very difficult to locate. When does anything start? But more or less acceptable origins of the conflict. From here, I can see how this works. From here, I can see how this pattern of relating is happening and has happened. And from here, I can go back in there and modify. That's what the task will involve. From here, I can go back in there and modify whatever, somehow. Now, Sugata Siri already knows that white racism is powered not simply by ugly, demonic, cancerous malevolence, but by what some people of European heritage experience as their own oppression. Maybe it's time to take the quotes off European heritage. What some people of European heritage experience as their own oppression, the widespread contempt for rednecks, which is culturally totally acceptable. It's the only racist joke that you can tell and get away with. Things are changing a little bit. I'm not quite sure how, but you can tell redneck jokes. The feeling of exclusion from the benefits of multiculturalism that white trash experience. You can still use a term like white trash with more or less impunity. Why can't we have our own pride? Is a sort of naturally expectable response. As in heterosexual Pride Day, They tried to do that one gay pride day. There was a heterosexual pride effort in Queen's Park. They had 10 or 15 people coming out. You can parse that any way you like. What about bisexual pride day? Move back and forth between the two parades. Oh no, or are the bisexuals included in the gay pride parade? Well, doesn't that exclude them from the heterosexual pride parade? What are we going to do about these problems of exclusion and inclusion?
Could just call everybody queer that wants
Right.
and you can include the SM people too.
So European Heritage Week. What about European History Day? Let all the Italians and Portuguese and Greek and Jews and Irish and Scots and Germans and Swedes and so on learn a little bit about their own history. They don't know anything about their own history. Nothing. As I said before, not a thing. Robbie Burns Day just transpired. I know about it because I grew up surrounded by Scots in Calgary.
They had a pub at York.
They had a pub? Well, good for them. Do you know that I read the other day that 5 million, there are 5 million people of Scottish heritage in Canada? If we let Quebec go, it would be even more impressive, relatively speaking. Of course, there are a lot of people in Quebec who are both French and Scottish, so what are they supposed to do? It all gets so mixed up. So anyway, from their point of view, something is wrong somewhere, and Subanasiri from Thailand, and being a Buddhist, is more able to twig onto it than most people are. Something is wrong here somewhere in the lumping together of whites of all kinds into an oppressive group, sort of white males or something like that. They're told that since they are white, they couldn't possibly be oppressed. They belong to the oppressor group. White equals oppressor. Suganasiri's brief reference to capitalism indicates that he is aware of the dynamic of class lived as race. Okay, we should be aware of that, but not push it too far in the present conjuncture, because the point is that class is being lived as race. So you can't simply say to a white working class person, oh, well, it's really only your oppression as a working person that you're concerned with. Your concern about your European heritage is false consciousness, or something like that, something a little bit more polite. This neo-Nazi Hoffman, if you want to feel all sorts of righteous and angry emotions, you can go to his website, hoffman-info.com. It's the worst neo-Nazi stuff that I've ever seen. And it manages to be anti-Zionist and anti-Muslim, equal opportunity anti. Where it's like, he hates everyone and everything, except for the white working class. But he's a good national socialist, because he talks about the oppression of the white working class by the white ruling class with its Negro, allies. So it's the white elites with their colored allies who are oppressing the white working class. From his point of view, can you get into it? I mean, we've got to say it's not totally out to lunch. It's not like the moon is made of green cheese or something like that. Well, in Europe around World War II time, the liberals and the left said that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. Have you ever heard that expression? Anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. Socialists have to be especially careful these days about that. Anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, because the anti-Semites had a response to that. It's not as if they went, oh wow, we're being fools. Oh no, they just turned it right around on the socialists. They said, no, socialism is the anti-Semitism of fools. They were saying the real problem is the Jew. And it's the Jew, Karl Marx and others, who have such little appreciation of the importance of ethnic belonging that they tried to change the world into a kind of mixed up, multiracial mush. And it's the Jew who is behind everything. And socialism is just a kind of false consciousness. Socialism is a kind of false consciousness on the part of those who ought to be anti-Semites. You know that the Nazis picked up a lot from socialist practice, rhetoric, imagery, aesthetics, talking about European socialism at this period of time. For example, and vice versa. In terms of political opposition, we could also spend some time, which we won't hear about, how each person actually adopts some of each side actually adopts some of the tactics of the other. So the more they fight, the more they become like one another, like a partial incorporation of aspects of the other's approaches. But well, both these positions, by zeroing in on foolishness, are superior to contemporary evil hunters, I would think. I mean, those who said anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, certainly I agree with that, but those who said that socialism is the anti-Semitism of fools, that's also a position that's worth exploring for a few moments. Well, it reminds me of a graffiti I actually saw in New York. Am I rambling a little bit? Because this can feed into other forms of nationalism and racism. I saw this graffiti in New York years and years ago. The cause of crime. Notice we have one cause here. The cause of crime is the ghetto. Well, I could go along with that at the time, and still can. The cause of crime is the ghetto, and the cause of the ghetto, wait for it, is the Jew.
Wow. Where did you see that?
New York, graffiti,
What time period?
1970s,
Wow.
late 70s. So the neo-Jungians really have done good work here, taking it out of the analytical chamber into public, like this book, Faces of the Enemy. And there's a couple of neo-Jungian practitioners, Arnold and Amy Mindell. They have a book called The Leader as Martial Artist, where I get most of this stuff coming up now. They do a lot of work as facilitators of intergroup work. So when they say leader there, they mean, I think, mostly leader as facilitator, but it goes beyond that too, as we'll see as I explore their argument a bit. So they're talking about the same dynamic of first, second, and third positions without using those terms. They've got their own terms. And they put it this way, that each element, they talk about elements rather than positions. They say each element is actually more than itself. That's a good non-elementalistic way of putting it. Each element is actually more than itself. It has all the other elements and the total interactional pattern inside itself. That's a really good non-elementalistic framework. So they're saying each element actually has the other element and the total interactional pattern inside itself. That's a crude attempt at diagramming that. If I'm here, and 2 is here, and 3 is here, and I go into 2, then 2 is in me. And then if I go into 3, looking at 1 and 2, then 3 is in me too. They're all in me. And they're all in 2. And they're all in 3. So things get a little meta-complicated. If I have the total interactional pattern inside myself, and I've kind of retreated into first position, and I'm just intensifying, strengthening it more and more and more, and getting more and more indignant. Those who know me know what I'm talking about. Then I've forgotten about the second position, which is also mine. And I've talked about, and I've totally forgotten about the observer of the interaction, which is also mine. I become a dumbbell, an idiot. And I conduct foreign policy from this position.
You probably have a newspaper column too.
Yeah, that's right. Many websites and blogs from this position. And if I'm really smart, I'll pretend that I'm actually doing something like the whole thing there. Mendel describes political conflict as an interactional dynamic in which each element is possessed by a time spirit. I like this formulation because it works with the idea of possession. Possessed by a time spirit, like demonic possession, possessed by a time spirit. And I like the term time spirit rather than group spirit because time puts the date on it. I'm possessed by a historic group identity. I'm possessed by a historic group identity. I'm reduced to a historic group identity. So in working with such a dynamic, of course, we got to withdraw the projection and step out to third position. In working with such a dynamic as a resolution-oriented participant, as someone who is seeking peace rather than talking about seeking peace in order to distinguish oneself from the enemy who is not seeking peace, or as a mediator or facilitator, one should consciously empathize with all actors, Mendel says. One should consciously empathize, he says identify, with all actors. If each actor imagines herself into the other, possession by the time spirit is loosened. Possession by the time spirit is loosened. I mean, you don't want to get rid of it altogether. There is no pure, absolute cosmopolitan in my humble estimation. Making it easier for combatants to relate to one another more sanely. And Mendel goes on, it is equally important for everyone to identify with a meta-communicating part. In other words, to identify with the witness. To identify with self, to identify with other, and to identify with the witness. Of course, if you fully identify with the witness, you'd just be in absolute truth and the troubles of this world would not upset you. So again, it's partial rather than total identification. It's like if I identify totally with the witness, I'm out of here. Forget about me as far as bringing some sanity into the world is concerned. So it's important to create and mark out within oneself a part of self that can step out of the dynamic, observe it non-judgmentally, and when he talks this way, he's talking literally. When we get to the task, I'll try to show how he's talking literally close to the object of what you do in your imagination. You literally create within oneself a part of self that can literally step out of the dynamic and observe it and re-enter in your imagination, of course, but maybe even in space with a certain understanding of its relationality. With a certain understanding of its relationality. So he calls what Dilts calls the observer, he calls a meta-communicating part, a part that is communicating about the communication, multi-ordinally. Oh, you're demonizing me and I'm demonizing you. Isn't that fun? It's a meta-communication. And even if there's no immediate movement towards a resolution, and in hard cases there will be no immediate movement towards a resolution and no foreseeable movement towards a resolution, in really hard cases. But the conflict at least is raised to a higher level of sanity. The conflict at least, while not being resolved, is raised to a higher level of sanity. Even without moving towards a resolution, it's raised to a higher level of sanity. So it's work worth doing, even if it doesn't guarantee the victory of the forces of justice. As a matter of fact, one might want to reconsider what's involved in a notion like the victory of the forces of justice. Meta-communication, communication about communication from a higher multi-ordinal level, Korzybski would say. And there is a there is at least a better understanding of the relationality, of the relevant relationality here, of the emptiness of the selves involved. That wasn't there before. So it's not enough for someone to tell me, oh, you're a so-called Jew, because if anyone is going to be so-called in it, then everyone is so-called. There's no group free of the construction of the group in the imagination. If there's such a thing as the imagined community, all communities are equal, at least in this sense, that they're all equally imaginary. And hey, let's not mince words. The individual is imaginary too. The person. Hey, you there, as Althusser put it. So we're moving towards this task. But first, a poem by Leonard Cohen. Sorry, Shannon.
Does this replace the Michael Hoffman poem?
No, it doesn't replace it, but it could, in a sense, replace it. I haven't found his poem. The neo-Nazi Hoffman wrote a poem about his rage, in which he's owning his rage. He's explaining his rage in the poem. He's talking about the way he and his ancestors are being oppressed in the mountain states of the United States, Tennessee, Kentucky, and so on. How his ancestors were enslaved there, and how all the problems of the country are blamed on people like him. And of course, he ends up blaming the Jew for that. But if you gotta find someone, then Jews always one way, shape, or form or another. In the West, anyway, everywhere in the West, since they crucified our Lord, been available for opprobrium. You killed my God. That's the way it started out. It started that way. I mean, I was talking before about how hard it is to get back to origins. That's not the origin either. The Jews were making uses of themselves well before that. Yes. See, that's the part you would have to cut out, right? The Jews were making uses of themselves.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this is the land of hope and glory and free speech and taking everything out of context at all times. Right? Take everything out of context at all times. That is the law. That's the law. Think about it. Cohen wrote this poem, and it was published in Canadian Forum, December '93, with an illustration. I used to have that too, and maybe still have it somewhere. That was when Canadian Forum existed, the last Canadian magazine.
In what sense
It
was
was
it the
around
last?
for like about 100 years, and then people would rather read Walrus or something like that. Not that the Walrus is all that bad. The Canadian Forum was truly a great magazine. And it published this poem of Cohen's. I wonder how many people in this city live in furnished rooms. He's writing this in Montreal, and the picture that goes with the poem shows someone sitting at a desk in a furnished room, and there's a window there, and through the window you can see the windows of the house across the street. Hey, and as I did that, you could see it. Like, you went into first position with me, going into first position with Cohen, and we're going to see what he does now. I wonder how many people in the city live in furnished rooms. Late at night, when I look out at the buildings, what is he doing up? Why isn't he watching Comedy Channel? Late at night, when I look out at the buildings, I swear I see a face in every window looking back at me. Okay, so now we've got all these faces, first and second positions, multiple second positions. I see all these faces looking back at me. And when I turn away, I wonder how many go back to their desks and write this down. And when he says that, you're right in there as him writing that down. All those others and you, the reader, I feel, are right in there as him writing this down. So it turns on itself in what to me is a very pleasing manner. I wonder how many go back to their desks and write this down. What happens in your mind when you hear the word this? That's the point, I think, where it turns. one more thing, and yeah, one more thing, and then we'll adjourn until we can go directly into the task next time. So this is from Etc. actually, the General Semantics Journal, Volume 34, Number 4, page 292, 1951, a rare, appropriate academic reference. This is about a psychiatrist of the 50s, another forgotten genius of the 50s. This guy's name was, he was some kind of genius. I tried to read a book of his once. Trigant Burrows. So he was a well-known psychiatrist of the 40s, actually, who happened to exchange seats with a patient in the midst of a dialogue with a deeply troubled person. Okay, so he's sitting here. We have a deeply troubled person like William Burroughs sitting there, and in the midst of the dialogue, I can't remember exactly what happens. He goes out to the can, comes back and finds Burroughs sitting in his seat. So he has to sit in Burroughs' seat. You know, it's here I kind of lose interest in this whole.
Well, let's see how I feel.
So what happened to Burroughs was that he found himself so affected by the changes he felt. Because when he sat in that guy's seat, he sort of went into his body unconsciously in his imagination. And he felt so affected by the changes in his own professional self-assurance. He goes, oh, you know, who am I now? You know, now I'm the nut bar. Like, at least to some extent in his imagination, that he was eventually compelled to reorganize his whole approach to psychiatry. That's one of the many origins of this notion of diagramming and working with empathy in terms of spatial locations, either in diagrams or in actual movement. The task that I assign can be done in your imagination, or it can be done with actual, what they call spatial anchors. Just to give you a little preview. If I'm Trigant Burroughs and I'm standing here and I'm looking at William Burroughs, oh, that's right, Burrow and Burroughs. And I'm looking at William Burroughs, then if I'm looking at an image of William Burroughs, sorry, an imaginary Burroughs over there, and I walk over into Burroughs, and I assume his history, that's more powerful than if I just think about it sitting in the chair. So it's the actual use of space in order to facilitate the work of the task. And then for the observer position, I would walk out here somewhere, preferably equidistant between those two, because we would want to favor either side. So aesthetically, equidistant from both. And I can see what's happening between them from here. So you're sort of using the right brain, visualization, and spatial location in order to make real, bring closer to the object level, formulations at the label level, which if left there could be simply pious, like bumper stickers. He saw himself there through his patient's eyes, too. You know, not only did he pick up on his patient's life history, he found himself looking at himself through his patient's eyes, experiencing some of his patient's experience of himself. So Burrow becomes his patient experiencing Burrow. Until that moment in his career as a psychiatrist, so the story goes, he had primarily attended to the other in a linear, distanced manner, listened to his words and his own thoughts about his words, and to his own thoughts about his own thoughts about his words, not getting consciously very far into the unspeakable levels. Of course, he was called little unspeakable meanings. In order to do that, you actually have to travel. So what we're talking about now is empathy, a word that is thrown around a lot, together with other nice fuzzy ones like compassion, without much systematic, conscious work with the experience of empathy per se, which is what the task is going to be about. And I've sort of been plugging at this ever since trying to sell Hitler, you know. What is this? Selling Hitler, by God. Horowitz. Okay, is there any question or comment there so far? Yes, Laura?
I'm with you 100% on this, and I think it's, you know, I'm glad that there's been a move from the discursive to also a sort of a more sort of bodily practice.
It was supposed to be there from the beginning, like in following the breath to get the sense of self beyond stories,
Yeah.
and in the silent practice tasks.
Yeah.
But now the rubber hits the road, to coin a phrase, in terms of the real world as an interpersonal world.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just in terms of implementation, using it very loosely. I think that I mostly apply this to my family.
Oh, yes.
Predominantly.
If you want to do the task, you can write a report on
but
it.
I'm just wondering about, to make this convincing, like to for the other side to move to you as well, right? And there's this idea that once you move into the other side, you create a different passageway, and that'll sort of loosen the other position
Yes,
too.
yeah.
But there are people who just don't want to budge.
People who don't want to budge, of course.
Yeah.
And you could come out of this knowing, well, they're not going to budge, but it's not going to drive me nuts.
Mm-hmm. But there's often more at stake than just
There's often more at stake, sure. They're not going to budge and they're going to kill me, so, come to my funeral.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if nothing can be done, nothing can be done. And then we get Hiroshima, Nagasaki, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So how does it relate, like what you're describing, what Laura's describing, how does it relate to Gestalt therapy? Because I was in Gestalt therapy for about, 5 months or so. And a
Wow,
lot
I
of,
really hung in there for a while.
I did a lot of, which was really bizarre.
Chair work.
I did a lot of like moving from in between like 3 or 4 chairs.
Oh, yeah. They're mostly with parts of self, probably. Parts
And
of
other
self.
people.
Yeah, okay. Well, Gestalt therapists did contribute a lot to this discourse.
So is that kind of because they were working with...
Fritz Perls actually should get credit for inventing a lot of these processes, and they fed into NLP. Gestalt therapy is one of the ancestors of NLP, together with Ericksonian hypnosis and Korzybski's general semantics and other things.
So Gestalt is occupying positions of self, observer, and other you're dialoguing with. Is that
I
part
don't
of
know
it?
how good they were at formalizing the observer.
Oh yeah, that's true. That is actually true. Yeah.
I don't know how good they were at that.
In fact, that's not there.
No, it's probably not there. I think Pearls took general semantics workshop at some